"Why did you hide this ledger behind the freezer, Dad?" Evelyn Harper whispered into the empty diner, her fingers trembling around a grease-stained book that had been sealed inside the wall for years. 3 weeks earlier, a judge had signed away the last 31 years of her life. Her husband kept the lake house, the retirement accounts, and the future they had built together. Evelyn got an aging SUV, 3 cardboard boxes, and the keys to a roadside diner everyone in town called worthless. Now, standing in a room that smelled of rust, old coffee, and thawing ice, she stared at a ledger filled with names she recognized, and one sentence written in her father's hand that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. "If Dennis ever comes back for this place, don't let him." 3 days earlier, rain tapped against the windshield of Evelyn's 2008 Ford Explorer as she pulled off Highway 17 and turned onto the cracked access road leading to Harper's Diner. The wipers squeaked across the glass. The gas gauge sat just above empty. She had $218 left in her checking account, a stack of overdue utility bills in her purse, and a folded copy of her divorce decree tucked into the passenger seat beside her. Everything else she owned fit into 3 damp cardboard boxes in the back. One held family photographs. One held clothes. The third held things that no longer belonged anywhere. The diner appeared through the rain like a memory that had forgotten how to fade. The red neon sign had gone dark years ago. Half the letters were missing. Weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot. The building looked smaller than she remembered. Sadder. The last time Evelyn had been here was 12 years ago, after her father's funeral. Back then, Dennis had stood beside her with an arm around her shoulders and told her the property wasn't worth saving. Sell it. Take the tax write-off. Move on. So she locked the front door, handed the keys to a lawyer, and never came back. Until now. She shut off the engine and listened to the silence. No television. No husband walking through the kitchen. No familiar sounds from the house that legally belonged to someone else now. Just rain on metal and the ticking of a cooling engine. The courthouse had smelled like floor polish and stale air. Dennis hadn't even bothered to attend the final hearing. His attorney had handled everything. Professional, efficient, polite, almost kind. The kind of kindness that appears when someone is taking something from you and wants the process to go smoothly. The asset schedule had been only 6 pages long. Lake house, investments, retirement funds,
Baiklas.
savings. Then, near the bottom, one final entry. Harper's Diner. Estimated value, negligible. Evelyn remembered staring at that word. Negligible. 30 years of marriage reduced to paperwork. And the only thing nobody wanted was the building her father had spent his life inside. She stepped out into the rain and walked toward the front entrance. The old brass key resisted at first. Rust scraped inside the lock. For a moment she thought it wouldn't open. Then the mechanism clicked. The door swung inward with a long groan. Damp air rolled out to meet her. Dust floated through gray light leaking from the windows. The counter stools still stood in a row. A stack of upside-down coffee cups remained beside the register. Someone had left a handwritten pie menu on a bulletin board near the kitchen. Apple, peach, pecan. The prices belonged to another decade. Evelyn set down her boxes and walked behind the counter. Her father's coffee mug still sat beside the register. His reading glasses rested exactly where he had left them. She reached out and touched the frame. 31 years of marriage were gone. The house was gone. Most of her future was gone. But this place remained. And for the first time since leaving the courthouse, she made a decision that belonged entirely to her. She wasn't going to sell it. Not yet. As she turned to leave the office and begin cleaning, something caught her eye beneath the register. Scratched into the wood, almost invisible beneath layers of dust, were 6 words she had never seen before. Find the ledger before Dennis does. Find the ledger before Dennis does. Evelyn stared at the words for a long moment, her fingertips resting on the dusty wood beneath the register.
Zeng.
Continued tapping softly against the diner windows, but the sound seemed farther away now. Dennis. Her father's message hadn't said if Dennis comes back. It said before Dennis does, as though her father had expected it. as though somewhere in all the years between his death and her divorce, he had already seen something she hadn't. She swallowed hard and stepped back from the register. The room suddenly felt colder. That night she slept in the diner office because she had nowhere else to go. The office was barely 8 feet by 10 feet. A rusted filing cabinet leaned against one wall. A faded calendar from 2014 still hung beside the door. She spread an old blanket across a vinyl bench and used her winter coat as a pillow. Around midnight, she woke to the hum of an aging refrigeration unit somewhere in the kitchen. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. The divorce, the courthouse, the keys, the boxes, everything. She sat up and checked her phone. Her bank balance still read $218.34. The electric company wanted $146. The cell phone bill was due in 6 days. Her auto insurance payment was overdue. A yellow warning light had been glowing on the Explorer's dashboard for almost 3 months. She opened her purse and counted the cash she had left. $37. 2 20s would have felt comforting once. Now she counted quarters before buying coffee. Sleep never came back. The next morning she drove into town and parked outside a small laundromat. The dryer in the back of the diner hadn't worked in years. While clothes tumbled behind scratched glass doors, she sat on a plastic chair and opened the cardboard box labeled personal. Inside were 31 years of a life that no longer existed.
Wedding photographs.
Christmas cards. A Mother's Day drawing from her daughter, Lauren. A silver frame containing a picture taken at the lake house 15 years earlier. Dennis stood smiling beside her with one arm around her waist. Evelyn turned the frame face down. Across the room, 2 women folded laundry while discussing a property sale near the interstate. One mentioned Dennis Harper's name. She didn't mean to listen. She couldn't help it. "I heard he got the lake house outright," one woman said. "Good for him. And that old diner?" the other asked. "Nobody wants that place." They laughed softly and continued folding towels. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Nobody wants that place." She had heard the same sentence from Dennis himself. From lawyers. From neighbors. Even from her own daughter. Lauren hadn't meant to be cruel. She had simply been practical. "Mom, maybe it's time to let it go," she had said during a phone call 2 weeks earlier. "Sell the diner. Take whatever you can get." Evelyn understood why people thought that way. The building had been closed for over a decade. The roof leaked. The plumbing barely worked. The parking lot looked like a battlefield of potholes and weeds. But every time she touched the rusted key her father had left her, she felt something she couldn't explain. Not hope exactly. More like responsibility. Later that afternoon, she stopped by the county records office to request copies of the original property documents. The clerk behind the counter was polite but distracted until she mentioned Harper's Diner. Then something changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Just a brief hesitation. Barely a second. His fingers paused over the keyboard. "You're asking about the diner on Route 17? He said. "That's right. Interesting. Why?" The clerk shook his head. "No reason." He printed the records and slid them across the counter. Professional. Friendly. Finished. But as Evelyn gathered the papers, she noticed something odd. One parcel number appeared twice on 2 different property descriptions. The same land. The same acreage. 2 different filing dates. The clerk quickly reached for the documents as if he had shown her something by mistake. Then he stopped himself and forced a smile. Evelyn folded the records and slipped them into her purse. When she returned to the diner that evening, she placed the papers beside the register and looked around the dark dining room. Everybody saw a dead business. Everybody saw a building that should have been sold years ago. But for the first time, Evelyn began to suspect that the diner might be the only thing in her life that hadn't lied to her. The diner might be the only thing in her life that hadn't lied to her. The thought stayed with Evelyn long after darkness settled over Route 17. She sat alone at the counter with the county records spread across the scratched laminate surface. A single lamp illuminated the papers. Beyond the windows, the parking lot disappeared into blackness. Somewhere in the kitchen, An old compressor kicked on with a metallic groan before falling silent again. She studied the duplicated parcel number for the 5th time. Same acreage. Same legal description. Different filing dates separated by nearly 17 years. It made no sense. Eventually, she folded the documents and slipped them back into a manila envelope. The truth was she didn't know what any of it meant. What she did know was simpler. She had nowhere else to go. The next morning, she drove to a realtor's office in town. The building smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. She placed the diner paperwork on the desk of a woman named Cheryl and asked the question everyone expected her to ask. What could I realistically get for it? Cheryl reviewed the documents for less than 2 minutes before offering a sympathetic smile. Honestly, Evelyn nodded. The property has been closed for over a decade. The building needs significant work. The parking lot needs resurfacing. The kitchen equipment is outdated. In its current condition, it really doesn't have much market value. Market value. Another polite phrase. Like negligible. Like worthless. Like move on. Cheryl slid the folder back across the desk. If you find a buyer willing to take it as is, you might clear enough to pay some bills. Evelyn looked down at the paperwork. 31 years of marriage had ended in a courtroom. Now the last thing carrying her family name was being valued lower than some used pickup trucks parked outside. Thank you, she said quietly. She gathered the documents and left. Out in the parking lot, she sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The envelope rested on her lap. For several minutes she stared at the realtor's business card. Then she tore it in half. Not dramatically, not angrily, just decisively. The pieces dropped into the passenger seat. It was the first choice she had made entirely for herself in a very long time. She wasn't selling. Not yet. The decision felt less like hope and more like survival. Back at the diner, she unlocked the front door and walked inside carrying 2 bags of groceries from a discount market. Bread, peanut butter, soup, coffee. $31.82 spent carefully. Every purchase mattered now. She placed the groceries behind the counter and began cleaning again. Dust, cobwebs, broken shelves. Small tasks she could control. Hours passed. Near sunset, Frank from the hardware store stopped by carrying a cardboard box. Found these in the back, he said. Inside were replacement light bulbs and a roll of extension cord. You don't have to pay me yet. Evelyn thanked him. Frank glanced around the diner, then shook his head slowly. Most people would have sold it already. Most people have somewhere else to go. Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the kitchen, toward the rear of the building, toward the area where the old freezer sat. The expression lasted less than a second before disappearing. Your father loved this place, he finally said. Then he changed the subject. When he left, Evelyn stood in the doorway watching his truck disappear down the highway. The sunset painted the diner windows gold. She turned back toward the empty dining room and noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faded county map hanging crooked beside the office door. Dust covered most of it. She wiped it clean with her sleeve. Several locations had been circled in red pencil. The diner sat at the center of them all. Her father's handwriting filled the margins with dates and notes she couldn't yet understand. And near the bottom corner, almost hidden beneath years of grime, was a small hand-drawn arrow pointing directly toward the kitchen. Evelyn reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the old brass key while staring at the map, unaware that the building everyone had laughed at was not the end of her story, but the last door her father had left waiting for her to open. The last door her father had left waiting for her to open. That thought followed Evelyn into the kitchen as dusk settled outside the diner windows. The building seemed different after finding the map. Not friendlier, not less broken, just quieter, as if it were listening. She switched on her flashlight and stepped through the swinging kitchen door. The beam cut through years of dust suspended in the air. Stainless steel counters stretched along the walls, dulled by age and fingerprints that had long since disappeared. A row of coffee mugs still hung from hooks near the industrial sink. The smell was a strange mixture of rust, old grease, damp wood, and something faintly sweet trapped from another decade. It was the smell of a place abandoned slowly rather than all at once. Evelyn moved carefully across the floor. Every few steps, the worn tiles clicked beneath her shoes. A faded wall calendar still hung near the pantry entrance. October 2014. The page had never been turned. Beside it was a handwritten employee schedule curling away from the wall. Most of the names meant nothing to her now. Some were probably retired. Some had likely moved away. Some might no longer be alive. Time had stopped in this room while the rest of the world kept going. She paused beside a prep table and ran her fingers over a deep groove in the steel surface. Her father had once taught her how to slice tomatoes there during summer breaks. She could still hear his voice correcting her grip on the knife. The memory arrived so clearly that for a second she expected him to walk through the back door carrying a crate of produce. Instead, there was only silence and the faint buzz of electricity from somewhere in the building. Her phone vibrated. Hope flared for an instant. Maybe Lauren was calling. Maybe her daughter had changed her mind. Maybe someone finally wanted to know if she was okay. The screen showed a spam number from another state. Evelyn stared at it until the ringing stopped. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket without listening to the voicemail. She wasn't surprised anymore. The freezer room sat at the far end of the kitchen. A heavy insulated door separated it from the rest of the building. The hinges groaned. When she pulled it open, cold air no longer lived there, only shadows. Her flashlight swept across shelves, empty boxes, rusted brackets, and a massive commercial freezer unit pushed against the rear wall. The machine looked ancient, thick steel, rounded corners, the kind built to survive decades. Dust coated every surface except one narrow strip along the floor. Evelyn crouched down. A faint scrape mark ran through the dust. Not recent, but newer than everything around it, as though the freezer had been moved at some point after years of sitting still. She stood and examined the wall behind it. Most of the paint had yellowed with age. One section near the floor had not. The color difference was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Her flashlight lingered there. Something about the panel felt wrong. The diner settled around her with small sounds. A distant creak from the ceiling. The tick of cooling metal. Wind brushing against the exterior walls. Then another sound. Different. Hollow. Evelyn picked up a screwdriver from a nearby drawer and tapped the wall gently. Solid. 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 Then one section answered with a dull, empty echo. She froze. The sound wasn't loud. But it didn't belong. She tapped again. The hollow space answered once more from somewhere behind the wall. Slowly, she lowered the screwdriver and stared at the faded paint. Then she noticed something else. Near the baseboard, partially hidden beneath decades of dust, were 4 old bolt heads arranged in a rectangle around a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest of the room. And as the beam of her flashlight slid across the floor, it caught the edge of a narrow metal seam that looked very much like something had once been hidden there on purpose. The beam of her flashlight slid across the floor and caught the edge of a narrow metal seam that looked very much like something had once been hidden there on purpose. Evelyn crouched beside it for several seconds, tracing the outline with her fingertips. The metal was cold and buried beneath layers of paint and grime. For a moment she considered prying it open immediately. Then she looked around the freezer room. The leaking ceiling, the rusted shelves, the extension cord running across the floor because half the outlets no longer worked. Whatever mystery waited behind that wall had apparently survived for years. Could survive a little longer. Right now she needed a roof that didn't drip onto her blanket. The next morning began with work. Real work. The kind that left your hands sore and your back aching. Evelyn climbed onto the roof with a borrowed ladder and a blue tarp Frank had sold her at cost. The November wind tugged at the plastic while she secured it over the worst leak with roofing nails and duct tape. Her knees protested every movement. By noon, her palms were raw. By 2 o'clock, she had consumed half a bottle of ibuprofen and most of her energy. But when rain clouds rolled through later that afternoon, only 1 bucket was needed inside instead of 4. That felt like victory. The days settled into a rhythm. Wake up. Check her bank account. Worry. Work. Sleep. Repeat. She cleaned windows until sunlight could finally reach the dining room floor. She hauled 6 contractor bags full of trash to the county dump. She scrubbed grease from kitchen counters that had not been touched in over a decade. She patched a broken side window with clear plastic sheeting and reinforced it with strips of silver duct tape. At night, she heated canned soup on a small camping stove and ate alone in a booth near the front window. Sometimes she found herself staring at the highway, counting headlights. Other times she stared at the old family photograph she kept face down beside her blanket. Looking at it still hurt too much. One evening, while replacing burned-out light bulbs above the counter, she remembered something her father used to say: "Buildings tell the truth if you listen long enough." At the time she had assumed he meant plumbing leaks and bad wiring. Now she wasn't so sure. 3 days later, while sweeping beneath the counter, her broom struck something metallic. The sound echoed sharply through the empty diner. She knelt and reached beneath the base cabinet. Her fingers found a small brass object hidden beneath decades of dust. Another key, smaller than the one her father had left her, older too. The metal was dark with age. She turned it over in her palm. No tag, no markings, just a worn key with a square head. At first she assumed it belonged to some forgotten cabinet or cash drawer. The diner had dozens of locks. It wasn't unusual. She slipped it into her pocket and continued working. But later that evening curiosity got the better of her. She tested it on the office filing cabinet. Nothing. The pantry lock. Nothing. The back entrance. Nothing. Every lock she could find rejected it. By sunset she had nearly convinced herself it was meaningless. Then she noticed something strange. The key wasn't worn evenly. Most keys develop scratches around the teeth. This one showed the deepest where near the stem, as if it had been inserted frequently into a lock much thicker than a normal door. She carried it into the freezer room. The flashlight illuminated the wall with the hidden seam, the row of bolts, the strange panel, the scrape marks behind the old freezer. None of it explained the key, but none of it felt accidental anymore either. Wind rattled the building. Somewhere overhead, water dripped into a bucket with slow, steady plinks. Evelyn leaned against the freezer and stared at the wall. Then her flashlight caught another detail she had missed before. One of the bolts near the floor had fresh tool marks compared to the others, as though someone had removed it and tightened it again years after the diner had supposedly been abandoned. She slowly wrapped her fingers around the old brass key, realizing that every bag of trash she hauled away seemed to uncover one more thing somebody had worked very hard to keep hidden. Every bag of trash she hauled away seemed to uncover one more thing somebody had worked very hard to keep hidden. Evelyn was carrying another contractor bag toward the dumpster behind the diner when she heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. A faded green pickup rolled into the parking lot and stopped beneath the broken diner sign. Frank stepped out holding a cardboard tray with 2 coffees balanced inside. The morning air smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. For a moment neither of them spoke. They simply looked at the diner standing against the gray November sky. "Figured you'd need this more than I do," Frank said, handing her one of the cups. The coffee was still hot. Evelyn wrapped both hands around it. The warmth felt almost luxurious. "I can pay you back." Frank snorted softly. "You can pay me back by not falling off that roof." Evelyn laughed for the first time in days. The sound surprised her. Frank spent the next hour helping her carry broken shelving from the storage room. He wasn't fast anymore. His knees bothered him. His shoulders popped when he lifted anything heavy. But he showed up anyway. They worked mostly in silence until he paused beside an old booth near the front window. His weathered hand brushed the cracked vinyl. "Sat right here every Friday for 20 years, he said. "Your dad always knew my order before I opened the menu." Evelyn looked around the empty dining room. "People really came here that often?" Frank smiled. "You think folks came for the coffee?" His gaze drifted toward the counter. "Your father fed half this county during hard winters." Evelyn stopped sweeping. "What do you mean?" Frank hesitated. Just for a second. The smile faded slightly. "People hit rough patches. Farms failed. Medical bills piled up. Things happen. And Earl never asked too many questions. He picked up a broken chair and carried it toward the trash pile. The answer sounded complete. It wasn't. Evelyn could hear the missing pieces. Later that afternoon, while Frank worked on a faulty breaker box near the kitchen, Evelyn retrieved the old photograph she had found behind the freezer. She had cleaned most of the grime away the night before. 6 families stood in front of the diner. Children, parents, grandparents. Her father stood in the center. Everybody was smiling. Frank. He glanced over. Do you know these people? He walked across the room and took the photograph. The moment he saw it, something changed in his expression. Not fear. Recognition. Deep recognition. His thumb paused on one particular face. Where'd you find this? Behind the freezer. Frank looked toward the kitchen and then quickly back at the picture. Haven't seen this in years. Who are they? People your father cared about. Evelyn waited. Frank remained silent. That's not really an answer. He handed the photograph back. Sometimes it's the only answer you get. The words hung between them, 2 meanings hiding inside one sentence. Evelyn remembered the brass key in her pocket. She pulled it out and held it up. Do you recognize this? Frank's eyes landed on the key immediately. Too quickly. For a split second he looked as though he might say something important. Instead he shook his head. Old key. That's it. That's it. But his voice sounded different now. Careful. As if every word required measuring. They finished working near sunset. Before leaving, Frank placed a small paper bag on the counter. Inside were replacement screws, electrical tape, and a flashlight battery. Store credit, he said. I don't have an account. Your father did. Evelyn stared at him. Frank pulled on his jacket and headed toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, Your dad used to tell people that buildings remember things. Evelyn felt a chill. I remember him saying that. Frank nodded slowly. Most folks thought he was talking about old wood and old nails. He finally looked back at her. His eyes moved briefly toward the freezer room. He wasn't. Then he stepped outside into the fading light, leaving Evelyn alone with the photograph, the brass key, and the growing realization that Harper's Diner wasn't simply an abandoned building. It was the last witness to something the town still remembered but nobody seemed willing to name. It was the last witness to something the town still remembered but nobody seemed willing to name. Evelyn stood alone behind the counter long after Frank's truck disappeared down the highway. The diner felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because she could no longer convince herself that the strange details scattered through the building were accidents. The photograph, the key, the duplicate parcel number, the hidden note beneath the register. Individually, they could be explained away. Together, they felt like pieces of a conversation she wasn't allowed to hear yet. Wind rattled the windows as darkness settled outside. She picked up the old county map again and spread it across the counter. The paper crackled beneath her hands. Several locations remained circled in red pencil, all connected by faint lines drawn so lightly they were nearly invisible. The diner sat in the middle. She traced the lines with her finger. Farms, small houses, a church, an old feed store that no longer existed. It looked less like a map and more like a network. Her father hadn't circled these places randomly. He had been tracking something. The next morning brought cold rain. Water drummed softly against the patched section of roof while Evelyn carried a measuring tape into the freezer room. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, only that she needed to stop guessing. The massive commercial freezer still sat against the rear wall like a steel monument. She measured the exterior wall from the outside of the building first. 43 feet, 8 inches. Then she measured the same wall from inside the freezer room. 40 feet, 3 inches. She checked twice. Same result. 3 feet and 5 inches were missing. Evelyn lowered the tape measure slowly. There should not have been 3 extra feet hiding inside a building this size. At first she tried explaining it away. Insulation, construction differences, measurement error. But none of those explanations survived a second look. The numbers simply didn't fit. She grabbed her flashlight and studied the wall again. The painted section near the floor remained slightly different in color. The bolt heads were still arranged in that strange rectangle. The scrape marks behind the freezer pointed directly toward it. Too many clues now pointed to the same place. A loud crack of thunder rolled across the valley. Rain hammered the roof harder. Somewhere in the dining room, an old radio suddenly hissed to life for half a second before dying again. The burst of static made her jump. Silence followed. Then came another sound. A metallic click from behind the wall. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to make her freeze. Evelyn waited. Nothing. She stepped closer and pressed her ear. Against the painted surface. The wall felt cold. Empty somehow. Later that afternoon, she called the county office to ask about the duplicate parcel number. The clerk who answered sounded friendly until she mentioned Harper's Diner. Then the same hesitation returned. "Those files are archived," he said. "You'd have to submit a formal request." "Why?" "Procedure." "Is there a problem with the property?" A pause. "No, ma'am." The answer came too quickly. After hanging up, Evelyn stared at her phone. 10 minutes later, an unknown number called. She answered. Nobody spoke. She listened to breathing for several seconds before the line disconnected. Maybe it was nothing. A wrong number. Coincidence. Yet when she looked out the front window that evening, a dark SUV sat parked along the shoulder across the highway. The vehicle remained there for nearly 15 minutes before pulling away. She never saw the driver. Rain continued through the night. Water dripped steadily into a bucket near the kitchen entrance. Plink, plink, plink. Unable to sleep, Evelyn returned to the freezer room with a screwdriver and flashlight. She knelt beside the wall and examined the rectangle of bolts one more time. One bolt was newer than the others. One showed fresh tool marks. Her fingers moved across the metal until they found something hidden beneath years of paint. Tiny stamped numbers etched into the bolt head. She wiped away the grime with her sleeve. The numbers matched a sequence written in the corner of her father's map. And when she followed the line of bolts downward, she finally discovered what the paint had been trying to hide all these years. A narrow seam running from floor to ceiling, revealing the outline of a concealed panel that had been built to disappear. The outline of a concealed panel had been built to disappear. Evelyn knelt motionless in the beam of her flashlight, staring at the narrow seam running from floor to ceiling. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the roof. Inside, the freezer room seemed to hold its breath. She ran her fingers along the edge of the panel. The wood was smoother than the surrounding wall. Newer. Not new, but decades newer than anything else in the room. Someone had installed it carefully and then spent years making sure nobody noticed it existed. Buildings remember things, Frank had said. Maybe this one was finally ready to talk. She stood, crossed the room, and returned with a pry bar from her toolbox. The metal felt cold in her hands. For a moment she hesitated. Not because she was afraid of what she might find, but because once she opened it, there would be no pretending anymore. No more reasonable explanations. No more coincidences. Either the clues meant something or they didn't. Evelyn slipped the edge of the pry bar into the seam and pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her angle and tried again. A bolt groaned somewhere inside the wall. Paint cracked. Dust drifted down. Then came a sharp metallic pop. The panel shifted less than half an inch. Her pulse quickened. She worked slowly, loosening one hidden fastener at a time. The process took nearly 20 minutes. By the end, her shoulders ached and dust coated her sleeves. Finally, the panel swung inward. A stale smell rolled out. Not mold. Not rot. Old paper. Old cardboard. Old secrets. The hidden compartment was barely 3 feet wide and perhaps 4 feet deep. More storage alcove than room. The flashlight beam swept across shelves covered in dust. At first glance, it looked disappointing. A few boxes. An old coffee tin. A stack of binders. Nothing that explained years of mystery. Nothing that explained duplicate parcel numbers or secret notes. Evelyn almost laughed at herself. Maybe she had uncovered nothing more than forgotten business records. Then she noticed the boxes were arranged with unusual care, each one labeled in her father's handwriting. Not inventory, not taxes, names, real names, family names, the same names she had seen on the photograph, the same names she remembered hearing around town. Her heart thudded once, hard. She pulled down the nearest box and carried it into the kitchen. The cardboard felt brittle. The lid resisted before finally lifting free. Inside lay dozens of envelopes tied together with faded twine. Every envelope contained receipts, handwritten notes, mortgage statements, medical bills, and canceled checks. None belonged to her father. They belonged to other people. Farmers, widows, mechanics, teachers, families she barely knew. Evelyn sat on the cold tile floor and opened another envelope. Then another. Then another. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Someone had fallen behind on payments. Someone else had faced foreclosure, medical debt, crop failure, house repairs after storms. And beside each crisis was evidence that someone had quietly covered the difference. Small amounts sometimes, larger amounts other times. Always anonymous, always documented, always connected somehow to Harper's diner. Rain rattled the roof harder. Evelyn reached for the old coffee tin sitting on the bottom shelf. The lid was stuck. She twisted until it finally came loose with a dry metallic squeak. Inside lay a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Her breath caught. The cloth had protected it well. The leather cover remained intact despite its age. Coffee stains marked several pages. Corners were bent. The spine was cracked from years of use. This wasn't something hidden in a hurry. This was something preserved. Evelyn carried the ledger to the counter beneath better light. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cover. The first pages contained names and dates stretching back decades. Hundreds of entries written in her father's familiar hand. Some included amounts. Others included addresses. Certain names appeared repeatedly. A few entries were marked with red pencil. She turned pages carefully. Then she stopped. One date made no sense. According to the ledger, her father had recorded a transaction nearly 6 months after his death. Evelyn blinked and checked again. Same date, same handwriting.
Impossible.
She flipped backward, searching for context. Halfway down the page, a single line had been underlined twice. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear enough to read. She stared at them until the room seemed to tilt around her. The entry wasn't about money. It wasn't about land. It wasn't even about the diner. It was about her. If anything happens to Evelyn, deliver parcel 17 only to her daughter, Lauren Harper. If anything happens to Evelyn, deliver parcel 17 only to her daughter, Lauren Harper. The words seemed to pull the air from the room. Evelyn sat motionless at the counter, one hand resting on the open ledger while rain whispered against the diner windows. Her father had died 12 years ago. Lauren had been a teenager then. Why would he write instructions about a parcel nobody had ever mentioned? And how could an entry exist 6 months after his death? She read the line again, then a third time. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every loop of every letter belonged to Earl Harper. The same hand that had signed birthday cards. The same hand that had taught her cursive at the kitchen table. Yet the date remained impossible. Slowly, she closed the ledger and stared across the empty diner. The old neon sign outside cast faint red reflections across the floor. Somewhere in the darkness, the compressor rattled once and fell silent. By midnight, she had opened nearly every box from the hidden compartment. The deeper she dug, the less the collection looked like business records, and the more it resembled a map of lives her father had quietly protected. There were hospital bills marked paid in red ink. Mortgage statements with handwritten notes attached. Utility shut-off notices folded beside canceled checks. One envelope contained receipts from a pharmacy dating back almost 20 years. Another held a church donation ledger with names highlighted in pencil. Each file told the same story. Somebody was about to lose something. Then somehow they didn't. Not because a bank stepped in. Not because a charity arrived. Because Earl Harper had. The realization settled heavily over her. Growing up, she had known her father as a diner owner. Stubborn, practical, sometimes difficult. She had never known he spent decades quietly holding entire families together. Near the bottom of one box she found a bundle of letters tied with fading blue ribbon. None had been mailed. The envelopes carried no stamps. Most were addressed simply by first name. Dear Thomas. Dear Ruth.
Durban.
Some were thank you letters written by people whose names appeared in the ledger. Others looked unfinished, as if her father had started writing and stopped. One letter caught her attention immediately. The envelope was addressed to Evelyn. Her breath caught. Carefully she opened it. The paper inside had yellowed with age. The first sentence was crossed out. The second began differently. If you're reading this, then either I waited too long or someone forced my hand. Evelyn stared at the page. The letter ended abruptly after only 2 paragraphs. The rest was missing, torn away. She searched the envelope again. Nothing. Another piece of the story deliberately removed. The next morning she drove to Frank's hardware store carrying the ledger and one of the letters. Bells jingled above the door as she entered. Frank was stocking shelves near the back. The moment he saw the ledger under her arm, his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition, like seeing an old friend return after years away. You found it, he said quietly. Evelyn stopped. You knew it existed. Frank looked away. I knew your father kept records. Records of what? For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked to the front window and looked out at the street. People think towns survive because of businesses, he said. Truth is, towns survive because somebody decides not to let another family fall through the cracks. Evelyn set the ledger on the counter. Why didn't he tell me? Frank's jaw tightened. The answer seemed close. Too close. But once again he stopped himself. Some promises are easier to keep than explain. Then she showed him the torn letter. Frank's eyes narrowed immediately. Where did you get this? In the hidden compartment. He read the first line and grew unusually quiet. When he finally handed it back, his gaze lingered on a name written near the bottom margin. Not Earl Harper. Not Evelyn. Another name. One that appeared several times throughout the ledger. Martin Keene. Evelyn had never heard of him. Yet Frank reacted as though he had touched a live wire. Who is Martin Keene? She asked. Frank looked toward the diner across the highway, now barely visible through the gray morning rain. A man your father spent years trying to keep away from something. What something? Frank's eyes settled on the ledger. That's what he was. Hoping you'd figure out. Evelyn followed his gaze. For the first time she understood that the hidden records, the impossible dates, the parcel number, and the diner itself were not separate mysteries. They were breadcrumbs. And somewhere ahead, her father was still leading her toward a truth he had spent half a lifetime protecting. They were breadcrumbs. And somewhere ahead, her father was still leading her toward a truth he had spent half a lifetime protecting. Evelyn could not stop thinking about the name Martin Keene. The way Frank had reacted to it bothered her more than the name itself. It wasn't fear she had seen in the old man's eyes. It was recognition mixed with regret. The kind of expression people wear when they remember a mistake that cost someone else dearly. The following morning, she drove to the county records office before it opened. Frost still clung to the grass along the highway. Her travel mug held coffee brewed from the diner's ancient machine, which she had somehow coaxed back to life the night before. The machine leaked. The coffee tasted terrible. She drank it anyway. At the records counter, she requested every file connected to Parcel 17, the duplicate parcel number, and the names Earl Harper and Martin Keene. The clerk was not the same man she had spoken to before. This woman was younger, efficient, and clearly uninterested in local gossip. She disappeared into the archive room and returned nearly 40 minutes later carrying 3 thick folders. Evelyn spent the next 2 hours at a wooden research table beneath fluorescent lights. Slowly, a picture emerged. Parcel 17 was not part of the diner itself. It was a separate tract of land located directly behind several adjoining properties. On paper, it looked insignificant. Just under 11 acres. mostly undeveloped. Yet as she compared maps from different decades, something strange appeared. The parcel sat in the exact center of several easements, utility corridors, and access routes connecting multiple properties throughout the area. Without Parcel 17, future development in that section of the county became complicated. With it, millions of dollars in commercial expansion suddenly became possible. Evelyn sat back in her chair. The land wasn't valuable because of what stood on it. It was valuable because of where it was. Her pulse quickened. Then she found something even stranger. A transfer document drafted nearly 13 years earlier. The beneficiary line had been left blank. Not missing, intentionally blank. Attached to the file was a handwritten note signed by Earl Harper. Hold until conditions are satisfied. The county seal verified the document. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a story. It was legal. Somebody had gone to considerable effort to preserve control of Parcel 17. As she photographed the records with her phone, another name appeared repeatedly in supporting documents. Martin Keene, developer,
Investor.
land acquisition specialist. His company had attempted to purchase neighboring parcels for years. Several offers had been rejected. Several negotiations had abruptly ended. Earl Harper's name appeared at the center of many of them. Evelyn felt a cold sensation settle in her stomach. Her father had not simply owned a diner. He had been standing in someone's way. When she left the records office, a business card was tucked beneath her windshield wiper. There was no envelope, no note, just a clean white card embossed with silver lettering. Keene Development Group. On the back, someone had written a phone number and a single sentence. We should talk before you make a mistake. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. Then she folded the card and placed it in her pocket. That evening she spread maps, copies, and photographs across a booth inside the diner. The sun had already set. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The old neon sign flickered once and held steady. For the first time, she understood why someone might want this property abandoned. Why people preferred calling it worthless. Why nobody had challenged her decision to keep it. If Parcel 17 remained hidden, others benefited. If the diner disappeared, the trail disappeared with it. Her phone rang just after 8 o'clock. An unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. A pleasant male voice greeted her. Calm. Professional. Mrs. Harper, my name is Robert Sloan. Represent several investors interested in helping revitalize this area. Evelyn said nothing. We understand the diner may be difficult to maintain. We'd be happy to discuss purchasing the property. Not interested. A brief pause followed. You may not fully understand what you're holding. The sentence landed differently than he intended. Because for the first time, Evelyn suspected she finally was beginning to understand. After hanging up, she returned to the ledger. Near the back, she discovered a folded survey map hidden between 2 pages. A red circle marked Parcel 17. Beside it, in her father's handwriting, was a note written years before his death. Protect this land until the truth can be proven. She stared at the words long after the diner fell silent. Then headlights swept across the front windows. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot and stopped. The driver's door opened, and the first person to step out was Dennis. The first person to step out was Dennis. For a moment, Evelyn simply stared through the diner window, unable to reconcile the image with the memory she carried of him. He looked almost exactly the same. Expensive coat, polished shoes, confident posture. The kind of man who never appeared anywhere by accident. 12 years earlier, he had attended her father's funeral and spent less than 10 minutes inside the diner. 3 weeks earlier, he had happily accepted the court's valuation of the property as negligible. Now, suddenly, he was standing in the parking lot after dark. That alone told her more than any conversation could. Dennis entered with the familiar chime of the front door bell. His eyes swept across the room, lingering on the cleaned windows, repaired lights, and stacks of documents spread across the booth. You've been busy, he said. Evelyn remained seated. What are you doing here? Dennis smiled politely, not warmly, professionally. like a banker discussing paperwork. I wanted to check on you. She almost laughed. After 31 years, I think I know what concern looks like. The smile faded slightly. Dennis stepped closer. Evelyn, we both know this place is more complicated than either of us realized. There it was. Not worthless anymore. Complicated. Valuable people always changed vocabulary when money entered the conversation. Dennis slid a manila envelope across the table. What's this? A proposal. Evelyn didn't touch it. Dennis sat down across from her. I've spoken with people who understand commercial property. Apparently there may be development opportunities in this area. Maybe, as if he hadn't already done the research. You told me this place wasn't worth fixing. At the time, that appeared to be true. Evelyn looked at him for several seconds. The lie wasn't in his words. It was in how carefully he chose them. Finally, she opened the envelope. Inside was a purchase agreement, neatly printed, professionally prepared. The offer exceeded what she had expected the diner itself could ever be worth. But it was still far below the numbers she had begun uncovering through Parcel 17. Dennis folded his hands. You'd walk away debt-free. No legal battles. No property maintenance. No risk. Risk. The building has code issues, environmental concerns, possible title complications. His voice remained calm, reasonable, helpful. I'm only trying to prevent you from making a mistake. Evelyn stared at the signature line waiting for her name. 3 weeks ago he had fought to keep a lake house. Tonight he was fighting for a diner. The contrast said everything. Who told you about Parcel 17? She asked quietly. For the first time, Dennis hesitated. Barely a second. But it was enough. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. His jaw tightened. The polite mask slipped, then quickly returned. You don't fully understand what you're dealing with. The exact same sentence the developer's representative had used. Evelyn noticed it immediately. After Dennis left, she locked the front door and sat alone beneath the neon glow. The offer remained on the table. So did the growing realization that multiple people were suddenly reading from the same script. The next morning, the pressure escalated. A certified letter arrived from an attorney's office. Petition for review of marital asset disclosures. Dennis was requesting a reopening of property division. Proceedings based on newly discovered information. By afternoon, a county inspector arrived unexpectedly to examine code violations. Before sunset, another letter appeared warning of possible safety concerns. Individually, each action looked legitimate. Together, they felt coordinated. The diner suddenly had a deadline attached to it. Evelyn spent the evening organizing documents. Every photograph, every ledger page, every map. She photographed everything and uploaded copies to cloud storage. Then she hid the original ledger inside a locked compartment beneath the office floorboards. Her father had taught her long ago that important things deserved backup plans. Near midnight, while reviewing one of the files from the hidden compartment, she discovered something she had missed before. Folded between 2 property surveys was a carbon copy of a transfer document. Most of it matched the county version, except for one detail. On the county copy, a signature line appeared blank. On this copy, the signature line contained a witness name written in blue ink. Frank Sullivan. Beneath it was a date, a notary seal, and a handwritten note that had never appeared in the official file. Evelyn read the sentence twice before carefully sliding the document into a separate folder. Outside, headlights passed along the highway. Inside, the diner settled into silence. She was closer than ever to losing the property again. But unlike the first time, she now possessed a piece of evidence that neither Dennis nor anyone else seemed to know existed. She was closer than ever to losing the property again. But unlike the first time, she now possessed a piece of evidence that neither Dennis nor anyone else seemed to know existed. 3 days later, Evelyn walked into the county courthouse carrying a weathered leather folder beneath her arm. The building smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, exactly as it had on the day her marriage ended. The difference was that this time she wasn't arriving to surrender something. She was arriving to defend it. The hearing took place in a small conference room rather than a courtroom. A long oak table divided the space. Dennis sat beside his attorney. Two representatives from Keene Development occupied seats near the far wall. A county official reviewed documents at the head of the table. Everything appeared calm, professional, procedural. Yet Evelyn recognized the same strategy that had nearly taken everything from her before. Overwhelm the person with fewer resources. Make the outcome feel inevitable. Dennis's attorney began first. He spoke smoothly about newly discovered asset values, potential disclosure issues, and the importance of fairness in marital property division. The word fairness appeared 3 times in less than 5 minutes. Then came references to Evelyn's financial situation, the deteriorating condition of the diner, the possibility that she lacked the resources necessary to manage a commercially significant property. None of it sounded cruel. That was the point. It was designed to sound reasonable. When he finished, the county official turned toward Evelyn. "Mrs. Harper, do you wish to respond?" Evelyn placed the folder on the table. Her hands felt steady. Yes. She slid forward the first document. Not the deed. Not the ledger. Something smaller. The carbon copy she had discovered hidden among her father's records. The room barely reacted. Dennis's attorney glanced at it and continued organizing his notes. Then the county official noticed the witness signature. Frank Sullivan. His expression changed slightly. "This signature does not appear on the county version." "Exactly," Evelyn said. The attorney leaned forward. "Copies are not controlling documents."
No, Evelyn replied.
"But they can tell us where to look." The room grew quieter. Evelyn then produced photographs of the hidden compartment behind the freezer, the concealed panel, the records, the boxes, years of preserved documentation. Dennis's attorney objected immediately. "Those materials have not been authenticated." Evelyn nodded. "Then let's authenticate them." She opened the ledger. Hundreds of names, decades of entries, payments, property references, parcel numbers. The county official slowly turned pages. Several names were recognized immediately by people in the room. Local families, longtime residents, evidence that Earl Harper had carefully documented transactions for years. The atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of shift that happens when assumptions begin breaking apart. Then came the second layer. Evelyn presented the survey map with parcel 17 highlighted. Next to it, she placed the county records showing the blank beneficiary line. Finally, she produced her father's handwritten note. "Protect this land until the truth can be proven." Dennis's attorney stood. "Handwritten notes are not legal authority." "No," Evelyn agreed. "But witness testimony is." The door opened. Frank entered. Behind him came 2 elderly residents whose names appeared repeatedly throughout the ledger. Then another. Then another. Each carried copies of records, receipts, letters, and canceled checks connected to Earl Harper. One woman unfolded a hospital bill that had saved her husband from losing their home. Another presented correspondence documenting land payments Earl had made on behalf of struggling farmers. The room fell silent as the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Earl Harper had not hidden assets. He had preserved evidence. Dennis's attorney attempted one final explanation. Clerical errors, incomplete records, informal arrangements. Then Frank spoke. Calmly, clearly. He described witnessing Earl sign the transfer documents years earlier. He identified the missing beneficiary arrangement. He explained why the copy contained his signature. Because Earl had feared the original filing process would be interfered with before the conditions were met. Dennis's face lost color. Across the table, one representative from Keene Development stopped taking notes. The county official reviewed the documents again, this time much more carefully. Finally, he set down his pen. The motion seemed small, but nobody spoke. "Based on what has been presented," he said, "there is sufficient evidence to suspend the petition and initiate a formal review of the transfer record." The room stayed quiet. Dennis looked down. His attorney no longer appeared confident. For the first time since this began, nobody was speaking about what Evelyn couldn't do. They were speaking about what the evidence actually showed. When the meeting ended, people gathered around her instead of around the developers. Frank remained beside her near the courthouse steps as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot. The fight wasn't completely over. There would be more reviews, more paperwork, more questions. But the story had changed hands. Evelyn looked at the diner keys resting in her palm and thought about the ledger, the hidden room, the families her father had helped, and the land he had spent years protecting. The question was no longer whether she would lose it. The question was what she would choose to do with the legacy she had finally reclaimed. The question was no longer whether she would lose it. The question was what she would choose to do with the legacy she had finally reclaimed. The answer arrived slowly, one repaired window, one signed document, and one returned neighbor at a time. 6 weeks after the hearing, the county completed its review. The petition to reopen the divorce settlement was denied. The transfer documents connected to Parcel 17 were validated. The missing records were restored. Earl Harper's instructions were officially recognized. For the first time in years, the paper trail matched the truth. Evelyn sat in the county office holding a freshly recorded deed bearing her name. Not because someone had gifted it to her. Not because a judge felt sorry for her. Because the evidence had finally been heard. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Across town, Keene Development quietly withdrew its remaining acquisition offers. Investigations into several irregular land filings began shortly afterward. Nobody was marched away in handcuffs. Nobody delivered dramatic confessions. But people stopped pretending. The story that had been hidden for years was now visible to anyone willing to read it. Dennis never returned to court. He sent a brief letter through his attorney acknowledging the ruling and relinquishing further claims. The apology inside was careful and limited. Yet Evelyn noticed something important. For the first time, he referred to Harper's Diner as her property. Not a mistake. Not a burden. Not a worthless building. Hers. Winter gave way to spring. The diner changed with the seasons. Fresh paint covered weathered walls. The parking lot was patched. Volunteers appeared without being asked. Farmers brought lumber. Retired electricians fixed wiring. A former waitress returned carrying photographs she had saved for decades. Someone repaired the old neon sign. Someone else rebuilt the front porch. The place that had once looked abandoned now looked remembered. One afternoon, Evelyn unlocked a cabinet and removed the ledger. For months, it had been evidence. Protection. Proof. Now it became something else. She placed it inside a glass display case near the entrance. Beside it sat the old brass key, the faded photograph, and a small plaque. Not debts paid. Lives protected. Visitors stopped to read the names. Some cried. Some smiled. Some discovered relatives they never knew had been helped. The ledger was no longer a secret. It was a record of kindness that had survived longer than money ever could. On opening day, sunlight streamed through clean windows and settled across the counter where her father's coffee mug still sat. Frank occupied his usual booth near the front. Families filled the dining room. Laughter replaced silence. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the building. For a moment, Evelyn simply stood behind the register and looked around. This had once been the place where she slept on a bench because she had nowhere else to go. Now people called her owner, neighbor, friend. One customer even called her family. Late that evening, after the last customer left, she locked the front door and turned off most of the lights. Only the red glow of the neon sign remained. She carried her father's photograph into the office and placed it on the shelf beside the deed. Then she sat quietly and listened. No court deadlines. No threatening letters. No footsteps from people trying to take something away. Just the gentle hum of a building finally at peace. Outside, the diner sign shone across the highway. Inside, the ledger rested beneath glass where everyone could see it. The key was no longer a piece of rusted metal. The deed was no longer just paper. The hidden records were no longer secrets. They were proof that neither Earl Harper nor his daughter had ever been as insignificant as others claimed. Before heading upstairs to the small apartment she had finished renovating above the diner, Evelyn paused at the front window. The parking lot lights reflected softly across the pavement. Beyond them stretched the land her father had spent years protecting. She slipped the diner key into her pocket and smiled. Then she turned off the last light and climbed the stairs toward home, while below her the old diner stood glowing against the night, no longer a forgotten piece of junk, but a waiting inheritance that had simply needed someone wounded enough to recognize its value, kind enough to protect it, and patient enough to finally open the door.